Good morning, everyone. As we start this week, you might be wondering, Ashley, why are we reading the Romans reading instead of the Gospel reading from Matthew? It's an excellent question, and I don't have a particularly specific answer for it, other than last week when I was looking at the passages assigned for this Sunday. I read through them, and something just said, Ashley, you need to be preaching on the Romans text. And I don't know if that was because the Matthew text is about 3 verses long and it didn't pull me in right away. I don't know. But here we are. And so I'm preaching on the Romans text this week instead. And let me tell you, as I started to look more into this passage, I kept continuing to wonder why the Spirit would say, no, this is the passage that you're going to be preaching on this week. And so I want to start out by naming that discomfort, because I think this is an uncomfortable passage when we read it, particularly when we think about it from our own perspective, especially in the United States. And I think that's a lot because this passage uses a lot of metaphor with slavery. And so I want to start out by naming that discomfort and naming a few things with that discomfort. First is being that the Greek word for slave is actually both for slave and servant. It can mean either one. And so it's up to the translator to decide, based on the context, which word should be used. Now, in this passage, I think that slave is the right choice here. And we'll get into that in a little bit, but I think that was the right choice. Now, that being said, we also have to think about the fact that St. Paul, writing to the Romans, was not considering the context of the United States in 2020 and the history of slavery in the United States especially. And so we have to remember that the slavery that happened in the United States is different than the slavery that would have happened and what it would have meant during Paul's time. Now, all of that being said, it still is so important that we be very, very real about condemning slavery in any and all forms, whether it goes by the name of slavery or not. And I think that's because we have a Savior who talks about breaking the chains and liberating all people and setting us all free through grace. And so without that being our central message, with that being our central message, we can't condone any form of slavery then, even if it was different than what we know or now. And so I think the other part of this passage, the reason that it's good to talk about it, is because this is a difficult passage, but we can't ignore it. There's passages like this all throughout the Bible where we read it and we kind of squirm and we're like, oh, I don't think I agree with that, or I don't think I like that, or I don't think I understand that. And unless we talk about that, we are just ignoring sections of our scripture. And so we're talking about this difficult text this morning. Now, I'm going to give you a spoiler for kind of the base of my sermon as we go through it. So this is telling you what the end of my sermon is going to eventually get to. And that's that this passage is about freedom and liberation for all people. So, now that you have that spoiler, let's get to the end where we get to the actual reveal of that. So, we start out this passage and St. Paul is making this comparison, and he's talking about sin having dominion over us. And I think it's important that we go in and we read in verse 14, it says, "For sin will have no dominion over you, since you are not under law but under grace." Now, grace is such a big word, and we talk about it a lot, but this passage is saying that sin is not holding anything over us because grace has gotten rid of any debts that we might have to sin. That grace is bigger than sin or the laws that perpetuate sin. And so then when we read that, and we go down a few verses, we talk about the liberation from sin. So we go to end of verse 16, and it says, either of sin which leads you are obedient slaves, either of sin which leads to death, or of obedience which leads to righteousness. Now, in Greek, righteousness also means justice. And I think it's really, really important and key that when we have a word like this, just like servant and slave, that we remember that this word has both of the meanings that we understand as two different words. And so here, it's talking about this freedom from under sin's dominion leads us to righteousness, or leads us to justice. This liberation is all tied up in justice. And so I think that's just such a powerful statement, that our freedom through Christ leads us to justice and righteousness. Imagine all of us answering that call in our freedom to seek justice. I think of the popular verse, to seek justice and love mercy and walk humbly with our God, from Micah. This is what frees us to seek that justice and leads us there. And when we look at this passage, one of the hardest parts is this idea of being enslaved to God. And I'll admit, reading that, when I first was reading this, and I was like, ooh, that something doesn't sit right with me. And that, I think, was justified, because God isn't a slave driver. And passages like this one have been used to paint God in that light in our history. And so it's scary to think that we have a God full of grace and love and justice and freedom, and that could be construed into this. And so I kept digging deeper, and I went back to Martin Luther's works, which I don't do very often. I do read Martin Luther's things sometimes, but I oftentimes find them very long and I get a little lost. But this time I read his commentary on Romans 6, and this part really stuck out to me. He said, "It's as though you owed something to a moneylender and couldn't pay him. You could be rid of him in one of two ways. Either he would take nothing from you and would tear up his account book, or a pious man would pay for you and give you what you needed to satisfy your debt." That's exactly how Christ freed us from the law. Therefore, our freedom is not a wild, fleshy freedom that has no obligation to do anything. On the contrary, it is a freedom that does a great deal, indeed everything, yet is free of the law's demands and debts. When I read that, I think to myself, all right, so when sin has dominion over us, over all of the parts inside of us that we may be ashamed of, or scared of, or that hurt, we are looking for a way to rid that, to break the chains of that, to be free from that. And so Christ is in this example, is this pious man who would pay for you and give you what you needed to satisfy that debt. And so that debt is no longer there. Because then Christ is also that first person who tears up his account book and the debt is gone. Because instead of Christ taking us on and now we still have that debt, but we no longer have that debt to sin, Christ says, no, that debt is just gone. It's grace has covered you. You're done. You're free. You're liberated. Your chains have been broken. You are no longer under sin's dominion. You are free. And this metaphor, analogy, however you want to put it, isn't perfect. And St. Paul even knows that. He talks about in here, he says that I'm speaking in human terms. And he says that because he realizes this is not the best way to describe this, but this is one way, and it kind of gets us to understand part of something that's inexplainable. I think it's very similar to how we talk about the Trinity. You know, we come up with these different ways to explain the Trinity, like water and ice and water vapor, or a 3-leaf clover, or my favorite Neapolitan ice cream. Ask me about it sometime. I can tell you all about it. But the truth is that none of those can really explain the mystery of the Trinity, but we use them to try in human terms because it helps us to better understand something that we will never fully understand. And so, our God, after coming and living as a human and dying on the cross and telling us all about this grace and this freedom, says, you are already free. I have set you free from the dominion of sin. And so then the next question is, what do we do with that freedom? And in this, Martin Luther answers, we answer the call to justice. We answer the call to righteousness that this freedom leads to. And so when we answer this call, then we are working towards that freedom and justice and liberation and righteousness for all. Because although in the kingdom of heaven this may be the case, and well, not maybe, this is the case in the kingdom of heaven, that all have been covered by Christ's grace. And so all have been set free and are liberated. We also, though we might know that, we also know that in our society right now, not all people are free and not all people are liberated. And specifically right now in our current state in our current state of living in the United States, we're focusing on the disproportionate amount of Black and Indigenous and people of color that are not free, that are not liberated. And I don't necessarily mean this literally, as in liberated like chains, which I think that is part of it, but liberated to walk down the street and feel safe. Liberated to not worry for their health. Liberated to not worry about their heritage being destroyed. And so, until all people are free here and now, we cannot claim this freedom fully because it's still leading to that path of justice, and we're not there yet. We're on the journey there. The Christian call to use this freedom to lead to justice leads us to freedom for all. It leads us to freedom for all, no matter your skin color, freedom no matter your heritage, freedom no matter your sexual orientation or gender expression, freedom no matter what language you speak, freedom no matter your economic or employment status, freedom no matter any of the many divides that we place upon one another in our society. Freedom from all of that, because then that freedom leads to justice, and justice that provides more freedom and liberation to feel safe and healthy and to love and to live without fear. This passage, though a difficult one and one that needs close reading and discussion and prayerful consideration, leads us to the understanding that we have been liberated. And by that liberation, we are freed to work for justice so that all may be liberated here and now and not have to wait for some future in heaven. And so in our freedom, where we are called to do that, where we are called to work towards that righteousness, that justice every day. Let's use our freedom well. Amen.